Good morning. I'm Nate. Welcome to Christ Church. We are starting a new series called Little Letters, Big Messages. We're going to take a look at each of the small, short books of the New Testament, the ones that just have one chapter. So we have Philemon, Jude, 2 John, and 3 John. And you probably haven't heard much about those at all, have you? I definitely haven't. And that's actually what gets me excited. I get excited to explore sections of Scripture or themes that are usually not explored. Because it kind of shines a light on a previously dark hole of the unknown. So, as mentioned, Andres Corrales was scheduled to bring the message on 2 John, actually. But since I had already started working on 3 John when he let me know he wasn't going to be able to make it, we're going to do 3 John today. But the order, it doesn't really matter because it's not like one of those sequels where you can't watch the third one without seeing the first and second. It's not like that. These are individual, independent letters. But first, a little bit of context. So 3 John, just like 2 John, 1 John, and the Gospel of John is written by, you guessed it, nice, John. And he is one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. He was actually the last apostle standing after all the rest had been killed for their faith. And actually, in the end, he was condemned to be exiled to this island called Patmos to serve out the rest of his days for his inability to stop speaking about this Jesus resurrected. And actually, Patmos Island is southwest, if you can see it in your mind, southwest of the city of Ephesus, which is in Turkey. They called it Asia Minor back then, but Ephesus, a city in Turkey, modern-day Turkey. And that is where most likely John served and wrote from as the main leader for a network of churches in the region. So John, in this third letter, as the elder in age and church leadership, is writing this guy, Gaius. He's a member of one of these churches in John's network of pastoral care. And this definitely qualifies as one of our little letters. It's just 14 verses, as I mentioned. And John says the same thing in both 2 and 3 John. How's it going? Thanks. He says that he doesn't really want to talk that much via letter, via pen and ink. He would rather talk more extensively in person. He says, I have much to write to you, but I don't want to do so with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we'll talk face to face. So this is like a quick text, right? Saying, hey, we have lots to talk about, but it'll be better and easier to talk in person, so let's meet up. And when I read that verse with Luisa, my wife, we both had the same reaction, like, yeah, I guess that makes sense for them, but come on, you're kind of leaving us hanging a little bit. Like, as readers, centuries later, we're left wishing he had written a little bit more detail. But yeah, if we put ourselves in their shoes, it makes sense. It was probably wisest to keep some of these conversations for when they saw each other. And we can relate to that, right? Maybe now more than ever during this, pandemic life. We all have our styles, though. Some people love to type out long WhatsApp messages where the reader has to hit see more like twice. I see people looking around. Others prefer to send 20-minute long audio messages, and you know who you are. But others text so short and dry and without emojis that you wonder if they like you or not. And you have to remember, no, it's just how they text. Well, I think John, he has a good balance. So it's short and sweet. He's just highlighting the main things he wants to cover when they see each other. But he's also sure to add emojis, let's say. Like, he's clear about his emotion and his affection to make sure Gaius really knew how highly he thought of him. And that's actually one of the main themes you'll notice when you go throughout this letter: reputation. Like, how are you spoken of? What are you known for? How do people think of you? And that's going to be our main focus today, because in 3 John we see a few different personalities, each with their reputations emphasized. So first we have Gaius. So I'll read again just verses 3 through 6. Again, it'll be good to keep it in front of you. We'll be referring to it. But in verse 3 it says, John says, "It gave me great joy to have some brothers come and tell me about your faithfulness to the truth and how you continue to walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Dear friend, you are faithful in what you're doing for the brothers, even though they're strangers to you. They have told the church about your love. You will do well to send them off on their way in a manner worthy of God." So his reputation was that he loves to put others first. That's like his thing. It's like when John thinks of Gaius, the first thing that comes to mind is this guy loves to put God and others before himself. And that's essentially what John means when he said Gaius is known for walking in the truth, which he equated with walking in love. Because truth and love are the two sides of the Jesus follower coin. And Gaius was specifically known for putting this into practice with his hospitality toward these traveling teachers of the truth. See, in these early years of the church being formed, missionaries were sent out to the different regions to preach the good news to people who hadn't heard, and also they went to established churches to preach the scriptures to them. And they were basically these itinerant preachers, and they were either the apostles themselves who had witnessed Jesus, or they were their authorized partners. So if you start to pay attention to it, when you read through the New Testament, you'll notice actually the important custom and Christian value, I guess, of hospitality in general, but especially for these gospel workers. It's referenced in 3 of these 4 little letters. See, at this time in the Greco-Roman world, like the Greek-Roman culture, the profession of a traveling public speaker was pretty common. And of course, they were known for their eloquence. And they also had the reputation for just peddling their speech, their message for profit. So, Christian missionaries like the Apostle Paul were super intentional to distance themselves and distinguish themselves from these other public speakers, these traveling speakers. So his teaching teams were famous for insisting that the people they're trying to reach should not be expected to contribute to them financially. And that legitimized the genuineness of their message. They said they didn't want to be a burden to others, an unnecessary burden, and this way they could try to avoid any gossip that they were just in it for the money or the fame like the rest. They valued their reputation of integrity. But of course, they still needed to be financially sustained since they devoted themselves full-time to the work. So, instead of the people receiving the good news, paying the bills, they called on Christians from local churches throughout the empire to support them on their journeys, whether it was with money or food or providing lodging for them when they stopped by in your town. So that's why we have in verses 7 through 8 in 3 John, it says, "It was for the sake of the name, Jesus, that these guys went out, receiving no help from the unbelievers. Therefore, we ought to support people like these." Another version says, by showing hospitality, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. And that's another big message from this little letter. That it's not just the missionary and the preacher that's doing this great work of God, but everyone who partners with them in prayer even, or financially, or in hospitality, or some other loving support, they were known as a fellow worker in the truth, a fellow worker in the mission. Those who send and support, they said, share in the work and the importance. So whether you personally go or you personally send, you're a significant piece in the mission because you are extending their reach and yours. So John says to Gaius, keep receiving them well and send them off well. It says in verse 6. Send them off in a manner worthy of God. And that makes me think of when I was in college and I would drive home for breaks in between semesters or a weekend, and my parents would welcome me with lots of love and hospitality while I was with them. But also, it stands out to me that sending me off well was a huge part of their hospitality. My mom made sure to not send me on my journey back to college without, water in the cup holder so I could stay hydrated, coffee to stay awake while driving. And my grandma would always make sure that I was well stocked with cookies. And she actually still does that when we go up and visit and we come back to Uruguay. So sometimes we have issues in customs, and I remember clearly my dad would typically take my truck out the night before I left and fill it up with gas. That's the kind of love that Gaius was showing his guests, and apparently he didn't even know them before. So in our context, what comes to your mind when you imagine how you could show hospitality or support someone in their need? What if we strive to have a reputation like Gaius, someone who puts God and others first in simple, practical, humble ways? And remember, John said we should especially support people who make it their vocation to reach others with adoption into God's family. In that way, we're elevated to this reputation of fellow worker in the mission. But then we have Diotrephes. Not only does he have a hard name to pronounce, but he's not the greatest. So Diotrephes, he seems to be a leader of Gaius' local church, which is under the pastoral care of John. And he's the opposite. He's the opposition of Gaius. So if we pick back up in verses 9 and 10, John says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first. Another version says he loves putting himself first. He will have nothing to do with us. He doesn't accept our authority. So if I come, or when I come, I will call attention to what he is doing, gossiping maliciously about us. Not satisfied with that, he refuses to welcome these brothers. He also stops those who want to do so, and even puts them out of the church. So it says it pretty clearly right there. His reputation is he loves to be first. That was like his thing. The first thing that comes to John's mind when he thinks of Diotrephes is he's a guy who loves to put himself first. And this is maybe a distorted extreme of caring about your reputation. Like he cared so much about being seen and how he was seen that it became his one motivation. But not to be seen as humble, faithful to the truth, faithful to love, hospitable. No, that image he seemed to actively work against. No, he wanted to be seen as the top dog, the impressive leader with unparalleled power and control over his people, influence and greatness. We've never heard of people like that, right? Certainly not in our governments, certainly not in churches. Well, interestingly, this description of Diotrephes matches the exact profile of the type of leader that Jesus really was not a fan of, that made him angry. Matthew 23 records Jesus pointing out these Jewish authorities in his day, called Pharisees, to his disciples. So this John, who's writing 3rd John, was there listening. Jesus said, these guys, everything they do is done for people to see. They make their boxes containing scripture verses wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. So the first thing that came to Jesus' mind when he thought of these Pharisees was, these guys love being first. They love all eyes on them. They like people thinking they're great. That was their thing. And he goes on to say that they also enjoy the power and controlling people, just like Diotrephes. It's almost like Diotrephes was imitating these leaders, like a child trying to mimic an adult, like their parent. But Jesus turned to John and the other disciples, who would be the founders of this new movement that Jesus was starting. And he said, our thing is going to be completely different. In our church leadership, you guys aren't going to love being first. You're not going to love these great titles. In fact, you're not going to give yourselves these great titles so you can feel above people and have this awesome reputation. You're not going to call yourselves rabbi and father and great guide with the purpose of lording over your authority. You guys are actually all equal brothers. You're not going to call each other this because I am, Jesus said, I am the rabbi, the father, the great guide, and no one else is on my level. And he dropped the mic, so to speak, with this: the greatest among you will actually be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That's how it works in Jesus' economy, so to speak. The upside-down kingdom, we've called it. The global church, made up of local churches that Jesus was setting up and putting these disciples in charge of starting, was going to be super countercultural. They weren't supposed to look to elevate themselves or seek these fancy titles to feel important and above people and have an exalted reputation. They were to view themselves as equals, as brothers and sisters with one Father, Rabbi and great guide, who's actually in charge. But actually to go even further, to view themselves as servants of the others. So John says to Gaius, I'm going to come and have a talk with this Diotrephes. I'm going to bring this up when I get there. Now you might think, okay, who's this John think he is? Oh, maybe he thinks he's pretty great to come in with his authority and call out Diotrephes. Well, I don't know. I think John knew he was not great, because he actually could approach Diotrephes about this pride issue because he himself, the young disciple John, learned this lesson the hard way. He and his brother James went to Jesus once. Actually, they brought their mom along to ask for them, which is kind of embarrassing. They wanted to ask Jesus, can John and his brother, can they be the top two in your kingdom? Like they have the top two places of authority in Jesus' kingdom, to sit at his right and his left at his throne. See, they loved the idea of being first. And the other disciples did not love the idea of them asking this. And Jesus said, guys, you know the rulers of these Gentile nations, they lord it over them, and their high officials, they exercise authority over them. It shall not be so with you. Instead, here it is again, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man, Jesus, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus said, be first by being last. Be great by being a servant. Be exalted by humbling yourself. And even Jesus, the only one worthy of claiming this authority, of this exaltation, this impressive reputation, even he modeled this servant leadership of the upside-down kingdom. So like kids trying to mimic their parent, children of God seek to imitate him. And when John went, I assume he was able to get there after this letter sometime to talk to Diotrephes, it's certainly possible that he used this well-known creed to confront him. Paul wrote it down. It says, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. But he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness, being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that's above every name. In 3 John, it says that these missionaries were sent out in this name. So, talking about Diotrephes, in the very same breath, John writes to Gaius, dear friend, don't imitate what is evil. So there's no mystery that he's referring to Diotrephes and the types of leaders that he was imitating. But then he says, imitate what's good. Anyone who does what is good is from God, and anyone who does what is evil has not seen God. That's verse 11. So your attitude should be that of the same as Christ, to imitate him because he's the definition of good. And in order to imitate someone, you have to have seen them. It's like if you're a comedian who does good impressions, right? If you're a comedian that does a good impression of some celebrity, obviously you need to observe that person. You need to study what they say and how they say it, their mannerisms. So notice that part in verse 11 that talks about not having seen God. There's this interesting theme throughout the New Testament, this connection between how well we see God or how much we fix our eyes on Jesus and becoming more and more like him in his goodness. The more we see God, the more we're concerned about how he sees us instead of people's eyes being on us. So the more we fix our eyes on Jesus, the more we contemplate him, the more we're transformed into his likeness. There it is again. See, by looking at Jesus, we both lower our view of ourselves in not being prideful, in light of the greatness of him. But then at the same time, we elevate our view of ourselves when we see who Jesus is inviting us to become, despite not deserving it. Because John in his first letter said, dear friends, we're children of God now. It's not a small thing. So because Jesus humbled himself and was obedient even to death on a cross for our pride and our rebellion, now we can be called children of God. And when we see Jesus fully, face to face, that is directly tied to the completion of this process. That's why John continues. He says, but we know when he appears, when we see him face to face, we shall be like him. For we shall see him as he is. Everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. So, right after John says, don't imitate evil, clearly referencing Diotrephes, he then says, let's imitate goodness. And in that same breath, he mentions this other guy, Demetrius, in verse 12, who was probably the one carrying this letter to Gaius and was going to be one of these traveling brothers who would need some hospitality. What a compliment to Demetrius. It was significant, if you look in verse 12 there, that John used his personal reputation of trustworthiness and truth to endorse him. It was significant that Demetrius was spoken well of by everyone, but most importantly, by the truth itself. And that's just a John way of referring to the Spirit of truth, God. So it mattered how John the pastor viewed him. It mattered how everyone viewed him, but most importantly, it mattered how God viewed him. Because when it comes to a reputation, it's not always up to us, is it? Because Diotrephes, in an effort to promote his reputation, was trying to stain and ruin the reputation of John and the others by gossiping maliciously about them. And in certain situations, you may have found yourself trying to do things the right way with integrity, and someone just wants to spread fake news and tarnish your reputation for some reason. I would not be surprised if you've experienced that. It hurts. But it's a reminder that God knows you inside and out. He knows the truth, and that's ultimately what matters. He'll be the judge at the end of the day. And Paul said, hey, am I trying to win the approval of human beings or to please God? Because if my goal was popularity, I would not be a servant of Christ. So John encourages Gaius to keep doing this, keep doing what he was doing, despite the demands and the threats. So to end, what do we do when someone is acting like Diotrephes? And what do we do if we realize we are being like him? Well, I want to learn how to better approach with courage and grace, and I want to learn how to be approachable with courage and grace. It's courage to confront someone, to try to remember that we are equal, we're brothers and sisters in God's eyes, but it's grace because respect is still due for all people, but especially the people that are in leadership positions in our life. It takes courage to approach when we feel someone is going in the wrong direction, and it takes grace to approach in the right way. But I think we can follow John's lead here. He went in person to talk to Diotrephes, to come to the defense of his faithful friend and others who were just trying to do the right thing and they were being harassed. When I was a kid, my parents tried to help me see when I tattled on my brother, like when I tried to get him in trouble, if my motivation was for his good or just for my desire to see him in trouble, I guess, or for me to feel like I was in the right. Those are two very different motivations. And the emotionally healthy relationships course that we have really helps. It helps to stop before you go and talk with someone, to examine yourself, to see what are your actual motivations with this. That's huge. But then, of course, you have the challenge to find the right words and the right way so that you encourage the other person to want to listen to you instead of like defending against an attack. So, these skills and more we learn in the Emotionally Healthy Relationships course, so you definitely should join this year if you can. But it's also important to stop and recognize how we can all easily become like Diotrephes. It's a great skill to learn how to approach with courage and grace, but maybe it's an even greater skill to learn how to be approached, to be approachable with courage and grace. It takes courage to be willing to listen to a criticism, right? And it takes grace to understand where they're coming from and not just jump on the defensive. I think that is super hard. Especially when you're focused on this reputation of greatness where you can't admit when you might be wrong. But I just want to say that one person that does come to mind who is really good at this, John Hamilton. He is actually well known for his humility and being really easy to approach, very accessible. That's like his thing. And I could talk like this because he's not here. It'd be kind of weird if he was sitting there. But I think he's a great, I've also told him this too, but I think he's a great example of someone who listens without becoming defensive. He's quick to apologize if necessary for any misunderstanding. And that leadership has created a culture here of people who are willing to do the same. But it is not easy. And I hope to grow in that personally. But I leave you with this question. What do you want to be known for? What do you want the first thing people think of to be when you come to their mind? That they would say, that's their thing. So let's encourage each other to fix our eyes on Jesus so that we both lower our view of ourselves in comparison with him and his greatness, but we also elevate our view of ourselves, being reminded of who he's asked us to be elevated to children of God and fellow worker in the mission. So let's seek the reputation of Gaius and look for practical ways to use our resources to serve others.